Hello, everybody. I just want to let you know before we get started here that at some point in the recording of this episode, something happened. Something happened to the computer, there was a phone got placed too close. Either way, something happened. And in the last 12 minutes of this podcast, it gets kind of distorted. You can still hear the recording, but there's some distortion. I just want to let you guys know that it was on our end. I apologize. To you guys, I apologize to Emmett because this is a great episode. Hopefully you guys can stick it out. If not, hey, I understand, and I do apologize. This is the growing pains of having a podcast and me being new and trying to figure this all out as I go. Again, I apologize to you, I apologize to Emmett, and I apologize to everybody. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for all the support. I will make sure that this problem never happens again. So without further ado, here it is. Welcome to the Young and Pruitt podcast. Like always, this podcast is brought to you by youngandpruitt.com. All the other previous podcasts are on there. Layla's blog is on there. Feel free to go over there and check it out. Hopefully you're listening to this on iTunes. If you're not, go over there, give us a review, give us a like, hit subscribe, all that stuff. Today's guest, we have Emmett Byrd. And Emmett has been a business manager. He's been a team manager. I appreciate you coming on, man.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Good to be here. I think I've done just about everything in NASCAR that there is to do, except for going over the wall.
No.
Or driving. I've gotten to drive stock cars. That's a lot of fun, but never was in a financial situation where I could have bought a race car or bought a ride. So I would have enjoyed doing that. Nothing's more fun than driving a race car. I can promise you that. But otherwise, I've done a little bit of everything. I've been a sponsor. Ran the sports marketing program for Napa. I worked at a racetrack for 4 years. Worked at Atlanta Motor Speedway. Have been a team manager for Cup team. And also was president and general manager of a NASCAR Truck Series team for a number of years. And so I've enjoyed all those roles.
So you were born and raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, correct?
That is correct.
And yes. Your father was Ben Byrd.
That is correct.
And
absolutely.
That's a pretty big name if you're from Knoxville, Tennessee, and as far as sports and sports telecasting and writing. And
yeah, my dad was sports editor of the Knoxville Journal for a number of years, all the way through my childhood, and he was named Sports Writer of the Year in the state of Tennessee a number of times. I think the number's 5, but there for a while he was winning it almost every other year. They try to spread those things out, but he had a tremendous career, and he was one of the first people in his profession to sort of cross market, for lack of a better term. He ended up doing a lot of radio. He had his own radio show, was a regular guest on a number of other shows, and then he also did television as well. He was co-host of what was then called the Ray Mears Show. Ray Mears was the basketball coach at the University of Tennessee, a very successful one, and my dad was the co-host of on that show with Ray and with another gentleman, John Ward, who was known as the voice of the Vols. And so it was in that environment that I grew up, a very sports oriented environment. And it was often that when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, that I would go and into the studio with my dad, probably because he couldn't find a babysitter, but then I would watch them tape the shows and stuff. So it was a really unique experience getting to be exposed to that and to all the coaches. I was telling a friend of mine this the other day. He's a big Wisconsin fan, planning on watching the Wisconsin-Michigan game this weekend. He's trying to plan out his day, and I said, I can tell you what, he's with his kids and stuff too. He's got to take care of the kids, but he's also got to watch the game. I said, when I grew up, here's what my dad would do. I would wake up really early on a Saturday morning. This is the mid-'60s, so 64, 65, 66. Around. We had an old beat-up Ford Falcon And we would pile into that thing, me and my dad, and it was nothing for us to drive to Atlanta, to Grant Field for a Georgia Tech game, or to Athens for a Georgia game, or to Lexington for a Kentucky Wildcats game. My dad tried to spread it out. He covered the entire SEC instead of just Tennessee football. And so Saturdays in the fall oftentimes was a full day. We would drive to, this is back even before the interstate systems, we would drive an old beat-up car. That Ford Falcon, if you took a left-hand turn, you had to be very careful because that door would open up and you'd find yourself out there. So that's how I spent my Saturdays, was going to places like that and then sitting in the press box for the entire time, watching the game. And then my dad would do a story, write his story after the game. And then we would drive back to Knoxville, oftentimes getting back at midnight or whatever. And I can remember being dark and fiddling with that AM radio dial to try to find the other football game, to try to find Alabama versus LSU or whoever it may be on that Saturday night. So that's the way my childhood was certainly at least it was football Saturdays, and then my dad had a real passion for basketball too, and so usually there were 2 basketball games in the middle of the week there that we would go to, and then later on my brother actually became an NCAA basketball coach, and I would take my dad to Nashville a lot of times or wherever they were playing. My brother's still NCAA basketball coach. Actually, he's 5th on the all-time win list among current NCAA Division I coaches at Belmont University.
Dang.
So you got Mike Krzyzewski, you got Roy Williams,
Bobby Knight.
Then you got, well, this is current ones.
Oh, sorry.
And then those guys, and then my brother. So I'm very proud of that. He got a big win this week. Monday night they hosted Vanderbilt actually, and were able to beat Vanderbilt 69-60. So,
dang.
So the legacy goes on. So I grew up very sports. How I got into racing, automobile racing.
I was going to ask if you ever went to the racetrack in Knoxville.
Oh, that's a great story.
No, I really didn't. There was Atomic Speedway was there, and then there's also one in Maryville. They actually used to host cup races in Maryville, right outside of Knoxville. This is back when they used to run 60 some odd cup races. They run them in the middle of the week. And so they had that facility there, which was a dirt track for a while, and then it was a paved track, and then they had Atomic. But I never went to the racetrack in Knoxville. As a kid, my grandparents lived in Daytona Beach. So we would visit them in the summer every year. And I can remember we went to some local track around there when I was just a little kid, very little. I can vaguely remember it, and I've become fascinated with the race cars. I thought that was the greatest thing I'd ever seen, was a race car. I just was just fascinated by it, and my parents noticed that or whatever. And then the first actual race I ever went to that I remember watching the race was there was a writer for the Knoxville Journal named Ted Griffith. He had actually worked for NASCAR too, but back in those days, newspapers were a big deal, and they had somebody for the NASCAR beat, somebody for the baseball beat. There were different beats so they actually had a NASCAR writer, and they were going to fly him to the race in Atlanta International Raceway at the time, 1976, and they said, "Do you want to go?" And so I hopped on the plane and flew down to Atlanta. We landed right next to the racetrack, and it was and I was a huge Richard Petty fan. I mean, I was just to be able to see that car, in that Petty blue, it was something else. And then David Pearson actually won the race that day, and that was the first race of any kind that I'd ever seen. And I just remember I thought it was the greatest thing ever. So I was fortunate enough, later on, I ended up working in the media myself in Knoxville. I worked for the ABC affiliate in Knoxville from 1985 through 1988. And then doing a story, I actually met a gentleman out of Crossville, Tennessee, named Bob Clark, who was starting his own Cup team, Winston Cup team. And we hit it off, and I started talking racing and everything like that. And he said, "I sure could use a guy like you, a young guy like you, to come in here and help us with he owned 3 different companies and stuff like that." And I thought, well, yeah, sure. He said, "Well, give me your number and I'll give you a call." I said, "Yeah, sure. That'll happen." The next week I got a call from another gentleman that worked for him. He said, "We want you to come up and interview you. They were interested in having you work for us." And so I moved to Crossville, Tennessee, and ended up working with Bob Clark on that number 31 Slender U Figure Salons Oldsmobile for the 1980, the 88 and 89 seasons. And that's how I got into motorsports. And it was like a dream come true, if you can imagine, just, working with somebody that had a Cup team. I thought that was the greatest thing ever. I mean, I'd done all sorts of I covered NCAA football and basketball, had covered a little bit of everything, but to finally make it where you could make a living off of working and racing, that was pretty fortunate.
And that's the golden era too. That was the.
It was different. It was so incredibly different because there weren't that many people in the garage area. There were certainly a lot. There's probably the same number of people in the Cup garage in 1988 as there is in the truck garage now. Just teams weren't that big. There wasn't that much media. Getting a pass to go into getting a garage pass was certainly a big deal, but it wasn't just completely crowded and stuff like that. So you kind of knew everybody once you got into the sport a little bit, you tended to know almost everybody in that garage area. And it was a great time to be involved and a great time to come into the sport, because for me, getting to hang out with guys like Bobby Allison, David wasn't running still at that time, but to see all those guys, to be around all those guys Cale Yarborough, Richard Petty especially, to get to be exposed to those guys and to actually on occasion be able to sit down and talk with them. I mean, it was a dream come true for somebody that I was such a diehard race fan as a kid. My dad would bring me home pictures of Richard Petty from the AP or UPI wire, and I'd put them on my walls. And every Sunday, instead of going out and playing like the rest of the kids, I was glued to the stereo downstairs listening to MRN broadcast, because at that point in time, there was maybe 3 or 4 races that were actually on TV, mm-hmm. almost none of them live. As you know, the first live race was the 1979 Daytona 500. Mm-hmm. But so when I was a kid, the only way really, you'd see some on Wild World of Sports, but it wouldn't even be live. So you had to listen to MRN, and Barney Hall, I can still hear him in my sleep.
Yeah, that 79 500. When that race was over, they didn't even go to victory lane. It was, Richard Petty won, there was the fight, and then it all ends quick.
Yeah.
I think that coverage was even beneficial to, there was a snowstorm.
Yeah.
A huge blizzard.
Yeah. And knocked out the
the perfect storm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember my brother had absolutely no interest in racing whatsoever. None. And I remember he was forced to watch it because, everybody snowed in and it was like the only thing on TV. And I remember him saying this, he goes, "This is the greatest thing ever. Look at this. They're fighting." It was like, and everybody had that. That moment was really the birth of the modern NASCAR era and all the growth that we've seen since then. It brought NASCAR into so many homes that it had never been into before. They saw it was a viable television product, and so from that point, once ESPN came in, and you saw it just became standard television fodder for everybody on the weekends, and that really fueled the growth.
So when you went from the Cup team back in 88, 89, what was the next step in the career? The next step for me, that Cup team, as many of them do, wasn't because they didn't have the money. It was they certainly had the money, but it ended up folding because of various business interests and stuff like that. So I maintained my contacts in racing. I went back to doing televised, doing NCAA football and basketball. I was doing the coaches shows at the University of Tennessee. I was producing other shows revolving around Tennessee sports. And then I also did a documentary called 100 Years of Volunteers about the first 100 years of Tennessee football. So that's what I did in the interim there, as soon as that Cup team folded. And in doing so, another gentleman that I had met while I was living in Crossville and had done some work with us for Bob Clark's businesses, he was managing Richard Petty's
1992 Fan Appreciation Tour. And he contacted me and said, this is what we're doing. It's going to be a big deal. And we'd like to somebody, I also shot stills at that time. They said, we want somebody to shoot video and stills of Richard's entire last year. And we talked about a number of different things. I said, look, I'm not going to shoot the stills and the video because it's just too difficult to do. And there are other people that are probably better on the still photography side than I am. But I sure am interested in this, and I'm interested in doing a documentary on Richard.
I was going to say, how pumped were you to get that phone call?
Yeah. So, and within 2 days, I was sitting in level cross in Richard's office across from him, and we were talking about doing this deal. And that night, I actually stayed in Richard's condo at Charlotte Motor Speedway, and the deal was done. And we were doing it. So I was there in 92 when Richard did his first press conference of the year. And then I made every single public appearance that Richard did that year in 1992. I documented it, and it became the documentary Richard Petty, The Legend. And it was done with a host communications in conjunction with ESPN, and we produced the documentary, and then it was sold in Walmart stores. Never Walmart was the biggest place, but it was everywhere. It was actually a very successful documentary, and it was great. And then Richard himself was the guy that got me my next job. I mean, Richard was so good to me. I can't tell you. He was great. So I was actually living in Atlanta. And Richard said, I'd love to have you come work for me. We just don't have anything open right now. And he went to Atlanta Motor Speedway. Ed Clark was the president. And Ed was talking about what they were doing, expanding, and how they were looking to add. And Richard told him, I got just the guy for you. And so Richard himself recommended me for what became my next job. I ended up working at Atlanta Motor Speedway for 4 years. And during a great time, because that time we had the last race of the year at Atlanta. We had two. We had one in the spring, which was usually colder than you could ever dream of.
Still is.
For some reason, Atlanta, you bring cup cars there, it becomes frigid. I remember literally one time the wind chill factor over the course of the weekend was minus 12. And matter of fact, my first race there was snowed out. We actually had 8 inches of snow, and I raced Rusty Wallace around the track, and we were doing some stuff for AP to try to just generate some publicity or whatever. And Rusty and I actually had a race around the track in the snow, and he beat me handily because I was in a Ford Probe and he was in a much heavier vehicle, so I didn't have the right vehicle.
My first race there, when we got there, it was the Nationwide race. When you walked out of the Nationwide garage and you looked down pit road, down towards stall 1, it was snowing so hard you couldn't see down pit road. It just whited out.
Wow.
And they ended up taking the green flag. It was like 29 or 30 degrees because it was warm when it was snowing, and then the sun came out and all the clouds moved, and the bottom dropped out. I remember having my coat over my fire suit. It was so cold.
That's when you know it's cold.
Yeah. It was freezing, but it's just whatever... like you were saying, whatever it is about cars going down there. It's
in the spring, in the fall. It generally somehow always ended up being nice or whatever. And we had several really nice weekends down there because at that point in time, we had, like in '93, the Xfinity race, the Busch Series, as it was then called. It got postponed in the spring because of inclement weather, but because of that snowstorm. And so when we came back in the fall, we had a triple championship weekend. We had the ARCA championship, the Busch Series championship, and the Winston Cup championship were all settled on that one weekend. And we drew huge crowds back then. It was just, it was amazing, the interest in Cup racing at that time. And we had some just tremendous crowds. We would get more people for an ARCA race than they do for some Cup races now. And
Wow.
That's because that's what the interest level, that was really the boom. That period in the mid-'90s, I would say, is probably the most popular time ever for NASCAR.
A lot of them would do double duty, wouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
They would run an ARCA car and run a Cup car.
Yes, yeah, they would. And there was something about that old track in Atlanta. The new one's great. Tremendous racing. I mean, they've had some really close finishes there, but that old track with it just a pure oval. It was like Dover, except 33% bigger, if you can imagine that. And that just, and it was 2/3 of the entire racetrack were turns. You were in the turns. The actual straightaways there were very short, still are. When you that what is now the backstretch Atlanta is still the same basic layout, but so much of that track were turns in it. It's just to put a premium and the speeds that those guys would run in those cars. I mean, there's something about a 1.5 mile track, that it's not like a short track. It's certainly not like a super speedway, but a really good intermediate track. You just get some tremendous racing, and we had great racing there at Atlanta for a number of years. So I was there for 4 years, and eventually got to where I was number 2 in the progression. There was Ed, and then I was actually the events manager among other things, and it was my responsibility basically to make sure that the event got run properly at Atlanta. So that taught me a lot. Actually, it was a really good experience, and working with Ed Clark was a great experience, and something that I'll always cherish, because I probably learned more during that 4 years than any time in my professional life. Learned a lot about business, learned a lot about people, learned a lot about getting people to work with you, and I dare say for you. You don't want to say that people work for you. I always say that people work with you. But if you get a team, it takes so many volunteers to run these events, these big events like that, and especially like the crowds we had back then. You need everybody pulling in the right direction, and that's the one skill I probably learned during that 4 years was, how to motivate people to want to work with you and accomplish great things.
Is it one of those things where everything seems to go wrong? You can have everything laid out as perfect as you want, and then the race weekend starts, and then this starts going wrong, that starts going wrong.
No, it's actually easier.
Yeah?
I say the same thing about going to the racetrack on the weekends. It's actually easier. People always say, these Cup teams, they're getting ready to break for the holiday break and for just a little bit of time that we get off in this sport. And people always say, you get to take 2 months off. That's the worst 2 months there is.
Yes.
You're trying to...
No days off.
No days off.
All your planning, you're having to order all the new parts, all the new uniforms. You're having to make sure that your entire team is filled. You actually work more. Once you start going to the racetrack, it's just reactionary.
It's like automated.
It is.
Automated. You know what you're going to do pretty much every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Same thing with putting on a big event like that. By the time that it gets there, all you're doing is reacting. You're reacting to, we had weather issues. We had giant tents to get blown away. We had all sorts of stuff. You just basically at that point react, and based on whatever happens, how you're supposed to react to it, and you just react accordingly.
So how much control does the sanctioning body have over the event for the weekend? Is it
a lot? I mean, they
so it's pretty much NASCAR's track. They pay that sanctioning, or you pay the sanctioning fee, but they pay the rent.
You work very close. You pay the sanctioning fee, which was even at that point was over $1 million.
Yeah,
certainly just for a Cup race. I saved my POs. Actually, first time I ever wrote a PO for over $1 million. I saved it. I should have framed it. But it was But that was the sanctioning fee for NASCAR. But you worked very closely with them, and with us having the last race of the year. We worked very closely with them on the championship stuff, and with Winston, with RJ Reynolds, on exactly what was going to take place, when, who gets interviewed, everything, who gets interviewed first in victory lane, how you're going to do all that. But you really had to work. Everything's plotted out, where you park every truck. One of the things that I would work on was the schedule that you see every week, and I would do a schedule, and I'd send it to NASCAR, and then they would send it back to me. A lot of times they wouldn't even they would say, I just basically talk on previous ones, and they'd say, this will work, or they'll say, no, let's give it a little bit more practice here, or we need a longer break there, or whatever. But you worked very closely with them, and it never felt like they were saying it's going to be our way or the highway. It had been done that way so many times that you pretty much knew what needed to be done and put in place. But I always found NASCAR really easy to work with on the race weekends. They're looking for the same thing you are, and that's for things to go smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the show needs to go correctly.
Yes, absolutely.
So you would set up the schedule for all the practicing and the qualifying and the garage opens at this time.
And I would send that to someone at NASCAR, and then they would review it, either mark it up and send it back to me with suggestions, or there was one time they just said, this is great. we'll go with that. Or, and then I also talk over it with Ed, and then, he might have a suggestion here or there, but, it was, and then, like I say, once the race weekends got there, you'd be amazed at how many volunteers how many people are willing to work for nothing to come and be part of those events. I think one of the cool things about Atlanta Motor Speedway is I would dare say it's probably the only speedway that a U.S. president has been a volunteer at. Jimmy Carter used to work there before he became governor.
I think he's volunteered to be just about anything.
Yeah, he would sell tickets and he did a lot. Evidently, this was way before my time, but he was involved. Of course, he was the first president to have all the Cup drivers come to the White House, and that's kind of become a tradition now. And so those guys got to go to the White House. Jimmy was a big NASCAR fan and supporter.
There's actually footage of Emmett in his role at Atlanta Motor Speedway.
Really?
Ian, our former guest on the
friend of the show.
Yeah, man, Ian's kind of just a historian and just a student and a lover of the sport. But I'm just randomly sitting around one day, and he's like, fast forward to this part of the YouTube clip, and sure enough, Emmett nails the. Was it Loy Allen that hit the wall?
Yeah, Loy Allen Jr. Had suffered a hard crash coming off of turn 4, and as part of my responsibilities at Atlanta, I was also in charge of the infield care center, and to make sure that things were running smoothly there. And then as soon as there was a wreck where somebody was actually taken in, I always went in and just made sure that everything was going smoothly. And so ESPN was doing the broadcast that day, and they saw me. We had to live flight him out. And so they were obviously very interested as part of the broadcast with what was happening with him. So I just gave a quick update.
It was pro. It's like that was the role he was born for. He could have been an ESPN anchor.
Yeah, but he had done all the broadcasting and all that stuff beforehand.
Well, that's the beautiful part about it. Is
he just stepped right in
there, done that.
You're perfect for this. Well.
You gotta dig pretty deep to find that clip.
I have no idea how Ian found that, but that's a very Ian move.
Yeah,
shout out to Ian.
Yeah.
So when it comes to rain coming, how hard is it to move the race up or
you can never move it up because of television.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that I've always wished that
they just did a couple races.
They did this year. That's the first time I've ever seen them move a race up. They moved it up, I think, 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But generally because of the locked-in television times, that's why you can never really move it up. I've always thought there should be some flexibility there, because there's been times, and I know it's happened to you guys, you sit at the racetrack all day long and you go out there for the national anthem and they sing it and they go, "Gentlemen, start your engines." And the rain comes down.
Yep.
And you're like, we could have gotten this whole thing in if we'd have just started it earlier. Mm-hmm. And instead you had to stay over, and it's a bugaboo for racetracks, for race teams, for the teams, certainly. It's more time away from your family, and rain is just, if there's a way that NASCAR could deal with the rain, like Formula One does, it would be a tremendous boon. But so far that's only happened on road courses, and which has provided some of the best racing you'll ever see. Mm-hmm. Road courses in the rain are a whole lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. I have to believe the Roval came out of necessity, because how many years in a row have we gotten the Charlotte Cup race?
Oh yeah,
in the fall,
rained out like 3 or 4 times. We had hurricanes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So at least we're going to run it no matter what.
It's still going to be interesting watching them enter 3 and 4. I know they got the chicanes right there, but I know entering 3 and 4 right through there.
That would be a real challenge for in the rain. For a rain tire, it would be a challenge for it not to chunk and fall apart because of the speeds that you're going to get at those parts of the racetrack, and also you don't see a rain tire run on a high banked racetrack either very much. So how it would hold up to that is going to be very interesting as well. But it's going to be, I haven't bought a ticket for a race in a really long time. I mean, and probably since 1980, or since the mid 80s, I have not bought, because generally I've worked in it. And if I need to get in, I can get in, or call the racetracks or whatever, figure out a way to get in. But that's one I'm going to buy a ticket for, and sit in the grandstand and watch, because that road course, is going to be, there's going to be more people punted in one day than we've seen perhaps in the last 3 years combined. And just by accident. They're not going to mean to do it, but just going to dive bomb. It's just that it's a really tight track. It's going to be a little bit like short track racing. And
they're also very cautious when they do run in the rain. If it starts downpouring, they're just going to stop it. It's got to be like a steady sprinkle. It can't be an all-out downpour.
Yeah, even Formula One.
Yeah,
they
there's a line.
Yeah,
it really is. They can't see, and the amount of water on the racetrack too is the biggest thing. It's when they get to the point where you're going to hydroplane no matter what tire you're running or whatever, then you just have to call it off. But they've had some tremendous Formula One races in the rain. Nothing's better than watching that. It's a lot of fun.
My favorite NASCAR race, I think overall, and we've talked about this, was Montreal.
Oh yeah,
in the rain.
I mean, that was just the best.
Yeah, I was up there for 2 of those.
Yeah, it's great racing. And Montreal is such a great racetrack.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's
beautiful.
It's a shame we don't race there anymore. And I think road course racing has really become a fan favorite just over the past 6 or 7 years, probably since, I think, those Montreal races had a lot to do with that. People were going, wow, this is something else here. And you just see, going to Road America was the best thing that NASCAR had ever done.
Yeah.
Road America it's certainly in my top 5. It's just a wonderful place. And it's just, it's 4.2 miles through the middle of the forest. I mean, what better could you have? And the fans there, I mean, you want to talk about support. That place is so big. They pack so many people, and there's so many people come in to camp just to be part of that weekend. Of course, everybody in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a partying state anyway.
Oh, yeah.
So it's, the amount of alcohol consumed at Road America over the course of that weekend is unbelievable. But there's respectful fans. They're very knowledgeable there. And I know that NASCAR's taking a look at it, but I urge them to run a cup race at Road America.
That'd be awesome.
They actually they ran a cup race there in the 50s, back in the day. So it would just be the greatest thing ever to see, some of those long straightaways and stuff. Road America's a tremendous racetrack, and it'd be great if they could find a way. I think they're worried about the ingress and egress with the amount of people that would be there for that race. The lack of hotel rooms perhaps in that area are big concerns to them, but if there was ever a way to do it, that's just a great racetrack.
I think if there's any group of people that still is into camping, I think it's the northern states.
Northern Midwest states.
Yeah, so I think that they got a lot of campgrounds, and the parties that go on in those woods back in there. I've always heard legends about those.
Oh, it's just walking around. I always spotted the road course races when I worked with Brian Scott, and I've done it for several other guys. But just to be able to walk around those and meet with the fans and talk with them, they're just so incredibly knowledgeable. Wisconsin has more racetracks than any other state in the union.
Really?
Believe it or not, yeah, and they have more short tracks. There's a Monday night track, a Tuesday night track. Those guys, like Rich Bickle. I'm good friends with Rich. He's run the late models up there for forever. Of course, they've got Slinger, which is the fastest, quarter mile track in the world, and but they have a track for every night of the week. And those guys, that's how they make their living, hauling around those late models. That's where Matt Kenseth obviously came from that.
Robbie Reiser.
Yeah, absolutely, and so very knowledgeable fans up there. And that every year, that was one of my favorite Xfinity races. When Brian Scott ran the Xfinity series, we got a chance to go up there, and would love to see the Cup cars, because there again, there's just something. It has the great equalizer. Whereas, you go to some of these 1.5 mile tracks, and the 78's just checked out, and nobody else really even has a chance, or the 4 car will be dialed in and for exactly what it needs. And, the other guys are literally just not in the same ballpark. So much happens on a road course. People run off course. People make mistakes. if you get mad at the guy in front of you, you could knock him off the racetrack without causing him the race. He just has to get back in line somewhere. It's it's a totally different type of racing, and it's very exciting. Like I say, I'll say it again, the NASCAR needs to take the Cup Series to that racetrack.
Yeah, just ask Jeremy Clements.
Oh yeah,
there is great equalizer.
We got a real treat of a race this year up there.
Just like Talladega and Daytona are great equalizers. Guys have won at those tracks that they've never won anywhere else. Same thing with road courses. And that's what we need is more of the great equalizer.
Yes.
You don't need to change the rules so all the guys run the same speed at 1.5 mile tracks. You just need to look at different ways I think more road courses are really what the fans would like to see.
Absolutely.
What's some other road courses you think would be a good addition?
Well, I thought, Montreal is just a great one.
Yeah.
Road Atlanta?
Road Atlanta would be certainly an interesting one to take a look at. There's obviously a wonderful racetrack sitting in Austin, Texas.
Yeah,
that would be.
That's essentially what I was trying to get out of
that I think everybody would love to see the Cup cars go to, and I know there's
except for Eddie Gossage.
Yeah, and he's only looking.
Bruton also have something to do with that about having another race in Texas? Like he's got the market cornered somehow.
And I think there's like a good bit of state tourist dollars that go towards hosting the Cup races there.
Mm-hmm. Eddie Gossage and Bruton are the masters of getting
municipality support.
Yes, and I worked with Bruton when I was at Atlanta. Bruton and I and Ed Clark went to visit the governor there and presented them with, things that we felt like would help, because our economic impact, even back in the mid '90s, was estimated at $455 million economic impact by just having our events at Atlanta Motor Speedway. Now there's a trickle down number. There's all sorts of equations about once a dollar spent, how many times it's spent over. In other words, somebody spends $1 to go to the racetrack, but it also goes to hotels, to restaurants, to whatever. There's an economic multiplier, and an economic study was done, and so it was obvious that we were bringing huge economic impact to the state and to the regional area. And so Bruton was really working the governor hard to get that, what is now known as Bruton Smith Highway there from the interstate. Because the biggest problem Atlanta faced was traffic. There was only one way in and out of there, and that was Highway 1941. And so by taking the old Highway 20 and making it a 4-lane, Highway 20 was the other way to get in and out, and it basically was a rabbit path at that point in time. So we went to the state capitol to lobby to get that road built, and of course they did build it, and it has helped tremendously. You can literally almost drive from the infield at Atlanta Motor Speedway straight out that back way and drive straight to the interstate and almost not have to stop now, which before it would take you 4 hours going north on 1941.
So before we get off this, what do you think the reason is for the decline in the attendance at Atlanta?
I think it's a number of things. Atlanta is such a diverse marketplace, and we face the same battle. I mean, we worked really hard to fill the stands when we were there. There's so many other things to do in the Atlanta area. Obviously you got the Braves, you got the Hawks, you got the Falcons, you've got
the Thrashers.
You got concerts, you've got restaurants. We drew a pretty good crowd from the metro Atlanta area, but really we got great crowds from the more rural areas, Macon, all of South Georgia. The Chattanooga area was huge for us, and Alabama was huge for us, for fans, race fans. So we drew heavily from those areas at that time. I think Atlanta's problem is the same problem that all Cup facilities face now, and all major sports are facing now. What you have is you've got these gorgeous high definition televisions. And, used to, like I said, when I grew up, there was no televised. If you want to see a Cup race, you had to go see it. Obviously now every single one is available in high definition. And you see that really happening in Major League Baseball. You see it happening even in the NFL to a certain degree. You see it happening on a lot of sports. It's not just stock car racing. It's not just NASCAR. Every single one of these are really have a hard time bringing the number. The only one that seems to be immune to it is college football, particularly in the South, because, people, I'm the same way. I grew up a Tennessee fan, and even though I don't go to many games anymore, it's just ingrained in me. Same thing, happens in Baton Rouge, Auburn, Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Athens, Georgia. All those people, they grew up their whole lives. Their grandfather was a fan. Their dad was. It's just ingrained. And so that, you haven't seen it. You still see the 100,000 people at Neyland Stadium. You still see the large crowds at Auburn. You still see the large crowds in Tuscaloosa. But other than that, no other sport has been immune to what's happened. Just the fact there's so many other things to do out there. And let's face it, if you stay at home, you don't have to pay the ticket price. You don't have to pay for, $9 for a beer, all that.
Gas, parking.
Yeah. So it's just, I think it's a matter of convenience. And so that's really what the biggest thing, but it's been, you see it in almost every sport, and, you can see it clearly in watching Major League Baseball games on TV, even, NBA games, even some NFL games, you're seeing some, a plethora of empty seats there. And it's just because, technology's gotten so good. I've seen some speculation that if football's still around in 30 years, it may be played in a television studio. That's actually because, all the technology, and they can just present it to you in such a way that you don't see when you go. Of course, there's nothing like going live. I love going. David, you went earlier this week to see the Panthers. So I love seeing that live event, and I grew up going to live events, but it's become so much easier now. And the technology is so good with television these days that I think that's probably the biggest factor.
It's hard to get people to do shit nowadays. Like,
yes,
it's hard to get people out, and I understand. Like, there's definitely the time crunch, but I mean, the tailgating experience for one thing. That leading up to the race is to me incredibly enjoyable, and then the actual sitting in the stands. Like, if you like to get drunk with your friends who like to get drunk with their friends and have a good time, well, just imagine that with 70,000 other people. And it's not like you're running into any issues or anything. Like, generally speaking, like if you're out of beer at a NASCAR race, within 3 arms length of you, somebody will make sure you're not
covered.
going parched.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's the same way with sunscreen, sandwiches, snacks. I mean, it's really hard. You have to be going to a NASCAR race either with a bad mindset, feeling bad, or having a nagging significant other who's having a bad time to really mess that up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's
I've been saying that it's not the product on the racetrack. It's not the product on the field that's doing it.
It's the same as
the world's
it's ever
changing.
been.
It's the generation. It's the generation Netflix.
Yeah.
That's what I call it.
Is most definitely generational. People consume their media in different ways. I grew up. We had the radio, and then we had the television, and you got 3 channels, and that was it. You had ABC, NBC, and CBS, and maybe one independent. When I grew up in the mid-'60s in Knoxville, Tennessee, when we wanted to change the channel in the winter, either my brother or my sister or I had to go outside around to the back of the house and twist the antenna, and the window would be open, and the other person was standing there and go, "Well, what? No, right there, that's it." So you had to actually, you changed the channel. You actually had to change where the antenna was pointed, and to get the best picture. And so that's all we had. Juxtapose that to how many podcasts can you listen to now? There's an infinite number.
Hopefully just one.
Yeah. How many, if you want to watch, I mean, you couldn't watch everything on YouTube if your life depended on it. You simply couldn't do it.
Right.
So there's just so many more things that people, and they consume things on their younger generation consumes media on their phone, which was obviously unheard of really even 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It just wasn't. So there's all these different things to do. And that's really it's not that it's a bad thing. It's just the way things are. They're changing. So, people say, well, we need to make the racing better. If you statistically take a look at racing in the golden era, in the 70s and the 80s and all those, the racing's actually, sure, you had great names and some great racing: Richard Petty, Bobby Allison, Cale Yarborough, David Pearson, Bobby Isaac. You had big heroes, great guys, some really good racing. But the number of people on the lead lap, there's 4 times as many people finishing on the lead lap now. The racing's actually much closer. Now, would we like to see it a little bit easier to perhaps pass and the dreaded bad air go away? NASCAR's worked really hard on that issue, and it seems to be that's the one thing they're always battling, is to make these cars to where it's just that you can come up and have more lead changes. And that's what NASCAR wants. They want more. That's what the fans want. But it's not easy to accomplish, but it's not because the product's bad right now. The product's really good. There's more race teams capable of winning perhaps now. Who would have ever thought that we'd be sitting here in 2017 with a team based out of Denver, North Carolina, Denver, Colorado, with the chance to win, a cup championship.
They start and parked for years, or they were like an R&D team, and they've become the standard.
When was the last time that a team that was not based in North Carolina won a cup championship? I've got an idea when it was, but I don't know.
Before my time.
Yeah.
It would be Bill Elliott, based out of Dawsonville.
Yeah.
That would be the only one I could just jump.
Yeah, just jumps right off the page.
As the most recent, yeah.
Yeah. There were certainly some before, but it's going to be really.
Anybody out of Virginia?
Yes, the Wood Brothers.
Wood Brothers, yeah.
Yeah, but the Wood Brothers didn't. They probably. I had to go back and look, but for years they didn't run every race. They were a part-time team. Now, when they showed up, they dominated. Even David Pearson, they didn't run every race. They weren't running for a cup championship. David won. Think about how many races he won. He's right behind Richard in terms of all-time wins. But
and that was kind of their thing too. Like, it wasn't like an issue for them to not go. It's like, okay, we're going to do this, and then
they had no desire to go do these short track races and stuff like that. They really just didn't. They wanted to show up for Daytona. They wanted to show up for the World 600. They wanted the big races. They would run all the big track races, but that was pretty much it.
I think it would be helpful for the sport if we had a team capable of running 10, 12 races a year that showed up with a dominant car.
Yes, I don't know why.
It would always be the wild card.
I don't know why. They might be. They better be plastering that in California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Hey, there's a team out here that you guys can get behind.
It's the West Coast team. Yeah, you can completely. Well, think about where Denver Broncos fans are. Vegas is a gigantic market for the Denver Broncos.
Yeah,
you can easily leverage that.
And when we go to Vegas, we go to California, and we go to Kansas, that's where Martin is going to get the most cheers, is at those racetracks, and even Phoenix.
Yeah, and also in the Northeast where he's from, Dover and those places are considered his home track. He's got a huge fan base there. But I think the awareness of the fact that it's become a big story. The fact that there's a team that used to, the prevailing attitude was you never want to run a cup team anywhere out except for the Charlotte area because you're not going to find the personnel that you need. You're not going to find also the parts and obviously everything was hubbed right here. And they've shown that it can be done differently, and they've gotten quality people, and they've either moved them out there or they've got them from that area, and I think in some ways it's helped them. There's a guy in Denver can't just decide that he gets mad one day and he's going to roll his toolbox across the parking lot to another team. He's got to push that toolbox a long way to find another race team.
Yeah. Now, We used to race out there at Pikes Peak, right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
So, okay, UFC does this all the time because it's so international. If they get a star or a lady, if they get a star that's coming up and they're either defending the title or they're going for a title or it's like a championship eliminator fight, they will make sure that fight is hosted in their city or their country of origin because they know that all the fans are going to pour out. Okay, now say Martin Truex wins the championship this weekend, and now he's the guy that's front and center. Would it not be smart to push for a race out in Denver to try to give those fans out there of him that opportunity to see him race out there?
It would be great. I think Denver would be a wonderful place.
There's a motorsports crowd out in Denver.
Yeah,
it's a gearhead town. Maybe more under the radar because it's overran by all the outdoor stuff you can do out there.
One of the biggest challenges you face these days when you talk about trying to find a venue or to build a venue is it's hard to get racetracks built. They take such a huge footprint. Well, it was 820 acres we had at Atlanta Motor Speedway, still there. And then the environmental concerns is probably the biggest thing when it comes to building a new racetrack. So you really have to have the total buy-in from the municipality, from the state, from everything, because from an environmental standpoint, it's just not only the noise and all the other things. It's basically what happens, and there have been many a racetrack planned that never got built because of the what they call the NIMBY factor, not in my backyard. People just don't want that in their backyard.
Is that essentially what happened to the New York City track?
That's exactly what happened there, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, they were really close to making that. It was going to be right next to the football stadium, wasn't it? Right there in that big swampy area.
There was one planned there. There was another one out on Long Island.
Island was the other one.
And the concerns on the Long Island was the same concerns that they would have. Certainly in Wisconsin or Road America is the ingress and the egress. Because I've never been to Long Island, but I've told there's only one way in and out.
Yeah, it's
the highway is pretty can be a nightmare to get in and out.
Yeah, I think
Zach was there for the Kentucky fiasco.
Oh my gosh. And that ruined that racetrack. They had so many.
They had a lot of momentum that they did.
Man, they fumbled that.
It's always
on the one.
It's the devil in the details. What actually happened in that they had hired a new company to come in and manage the traffic, and they had never. While they had done many concerts and football games and stuff like that, they had never done something that specifically. And it was really from what I understand, it was their procedures where they were stopping people so far out that didn't have the right parking passes or whatever, and making them turn around and stuff, that it just backed up. It just become, an accordion effect, and backed up people all the way to back onto the interstate, and
people were just pulling their cars off the interstate and just leaving them there, and then walking to the racetrack.
Same thing happened at Texas. The first ever Cup race they had there in 1997. I was there as a guest of CBS, and we were in a van with a bunch of people that were their guests, and we actually had to park on the interstate, and we walked in because what had happened was they had significant rains in the week leading up to it, and
Same thing happened to Kentucky.
All the parking lots were there was just a quagmire. There was no place to park, and people literally parked. We parked on the interstate, and we walked in, and we walked back out, and walked to the interstate to get back to our hotel.
Yeah, I have friends personally that were trying to go to that Kentucky race. Could see the racetrack, could hear the cars. Couldn't get there, couldn't turn around, couldn't do nothing. We had to drive down the median to get there. And, there's a couple cars followed in behind us, but we had to get there. We were on the race team. And we couldn't get there.
Yeah.
So that was an absolute mess.
And it's a shame because that is such a great race. Kentucky's another.
I love going to Kentucky.
It reminds me a little bit of the old Atlanta, in terms of just some of the way it looks and the way it sits, where it sits, and it's just got great racing, and it has really since they first built it. It's great sight lines there. You can sit. It and Las Vegas are both really, really good in the standpoint that you could sit in the first row of at those racetracks and see the entire racetrack. That doesn't happen.
Yeah,
a lot
it's so
of places.
high.
Yes,
they got that big concrete wall there.
Yeah.
And then it's taken them so long to finally get the weepers fixed at that place, because I've been there for an ARCA race before when the race was rain delayed for rain the day before, because
that happened with the Xfinity Series and truck race in 2015.
Yeah, because they couldn't stop the weepers. It just looked like a spring.
They've had that problem at Charlotte a number of times. And
Texas, we were there at Texas for 6-7 hours.
Yeah, exactly. It looked like
last year.
It looked like it wasn't going to be much of a problem at all. It'd be good if NASCAR could get rid of its rain issue.
The word
just
you do
run
not
them the
say.
way it is. I say run them in the rain.
So, all right, you left Atlanta. What was the next stop?
I went to work. I was recruited by an agency that was actually Prime Media, and they were doing a number of different projects with NASCAR, the NASCAR Garage television show. At one point in time, they had the NASCAR Cafe program was just coming into. There was a number of different licensing issues, and there was another thing called NASCAR World, which was another initiative that they were doing. And so I went to work with them, and I say briefly, I don't even remember how long I was there, but I wasn't there long, and I did some really good work particularly on the NASCAR Garage television show. I really enjoyed that part of it. Was a consultant to them, and then we also did the opening of the NASCAR Cafe in Myrtle Beach. But in the process of doing that, I got a call from a gentleman by the name of Bob McKenna, who was the president of Napa. Napa was our sponsor at Atlanta Motor Speedway, and I'd worked very closely with those guys and with the Napa 500. It was that was their biggest motorsports portfolio piece right there, and had done a lot of work with them. And once they found out that I left the Speedway, they said, "We're interested in having you come work with us. We just couldn't ask you when you were working for the Speedway." So I went to lunch with those guys, and they said, we want you to come in and manage our motorsports portfolio, which was pretty big at the time, and actually we expanded it quite a bit. At that point in time, they were doing the truck series with Dale Earnhardt Sr.
Hornaday truck, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Ron Hornaday was the driver. Ron Hornaday, can't say enough about him. Just a super person. He was a joy to work with, and still to this day, just a great guy. But they asked me, they said, "Will you come and help us manage our sports marketing program?" And so that was an easy. I really wasn't enjoying working in a high rise in downtown Atlanta. I was used to working on 820 acres, and whenever I felt confined in my office at Atlanta Motor Speedway, I could just always go out and find some place on those 820 acres where there was nobody else around, or just do something to breathe some fresh air. You can't do that in downtown Atlanta. I was not cut out to work in a small office in a downtown high rise. And as much as I liked what I was doing, it became a no-brainer for me to go to work for Napa. And so I did, and I managed their sports marketing program. And we did a number of different, it was great because we did truck races in Monroe, Washington. We sponsored the first ever race at California. It was the California 500 presented by Napa. So I worked with those guys to help pull that off. And Roger Penske owned the track at that point in time, and I worked with Roger's sons and those guys, and it was in the LA market. And we actually had a hospitality tent there for that first race. We had 10,000 people in a hospitality tent.
Wow.
at California. It was with live band, everything. It was just really cool. So we did some really neat events there. And we also did the truck race at, it's some smaller places. Nazareth, we did the truck race at Nazareth. So we did, it was just really good to do a lot of those type of events, and to work with a corporation as big as Napa. It was a lot of fun. So I did that for for parts of 2 seasons, and then I got recruited by a group out of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. They were following in the footsteps of the NASCAR Cafe program, which was actually managed by a guy that I knew very well. I'd worked with him at the University of Tennessee. He was actually my boss when I did the television shows with the University of Tennessee. He then became the president of the NASCAR Cafe program. Then there's this group out of Burroughs and Chapin out of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and they were planning the NASCAR Speed Park program. And so they were building NASCAR-themed amusement parks, and they wanted me to become the executive director of that program. And so that sounded like way too much fun to not at least give it a try. I mean, I could have done the safe thing and stayed in Atlanta and stayed at Napa. My wife was working for the Federal Reserve Bank at that time, and both of us had very secure jobs. But we felt like it was worth it to take a chance to try to just do something different. And that was certainly something different. We spent $15 million building the first NASCAR speed park in Myrtle Beach. And then we built the second one in Pigeon Forge. So I did that for a number of time. And we lived in Myrtle Beach. Everybody says, how was it living in Myrtle Beach? Did you like it? I was like, no, I didn't. I love the area. The people were great. The frustrating thing about it was
spring break.
Well, no, it's just you're there working all the time, and you're working in some cases 80 hours a week. You're a suit and tie. It's hot as can be, and everybody else is on vacation. That's not. That was the most frustrating thing. It was like, I'd rather be doing that than spending 80 hours a week working. So that part was a little bit frustrating, believe it or not. So stayed there, ended up moving back to the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and took a job as a team manager for Joe Bessie's race team, Cup team. Joe had been a friend of mine. I got to know him when I was working at Atlanta Motor Speedway and spent a lot of time with him there. And then he had formed a Cup team, the Power Team, the number 60, and was driven by Jeffrey Bodine. And so that's what brought me back here to the Charlotte area. And it was great. Been in the Charlotte area ever since. And that really just, once you're in the Charlotte area and you work in racing and you've proven that you're capable enough and turn 1 from turn 4, and you're willing to work hard, then you can pretty much always find a job in motorsports. So that was very fortunate for me. And it was actually very fortunate for my wife. She'd taken a job with what was then Nations Bank, became Bank of America. She's in banking. I'm in racing. Charlotte's really the place to be with either one of those. And she ended up working for corporate for Bank of America and was very successful with them. So it worked out really well for both of us. But I helped manage that program for Joe for the amount of time pretty much that he owned it. Really worked with Jeffrey. Jeffrey was an extremely talented driver. We had some really good runs in that car. We actually almost won at Martinsville with that car. And it was just Jeffrey was people don't understand how good of a race car driver Jeffrey Bodine was. He gets overlooked a lot. There's not a lot of guys out there with 18 Cup wins. And, he won the Daytona 500. He was a thorn in Dale Earnhardt Sr.'s side, certainly. They had a great rivalry. That was back when Bill Elliott was so successful too. So any given weekend, you would, in Jeff's heyday, you'd have Earnhardt, you'd have Elliott, you'd have Darrell Waltrip, and then you'd have that 5 car with Jeffrey in it. So it was really fun to work with him in that 60 car. We were a startup team, and we had some really good runs with it. The demise of that, Jeffrey wanted to run the truck race at Daytona. Mm-hmm. And so he was looking for a place to run the truck race. And I called a friend of mine who owned the 15 truck at the time, Billy Ballou. We had sponsored. The deal was, and this is why Jeffrey wanted to do it. His son was racing at the time. And so they had a deal with Line X for the first 4 races of the year. And Jeffrey was going to run Daytona because that was the first year the trucks ever went to Daytona. Yep. Jeffrey he loved racing at Daytona. He was a master at they weren't really using the plates back then. He was a master of the slingshot, everything. So I helped put a deal together for Jeffrey to go into that 15 truck, and most people know what happened there. If you don't, take a break, YouTube it, and you'll see one of the scariest crashes that you'll ever want to see in your life.
Yeah,
I've got the biggest piece left from that truck sitting in my garage. I've never seen such utter destruction of a race vehicle up until that point in time, and the fact that he lived through it, I'll never. I mean, I just remember that I was so shocked. I was on pit road for most of the race. I went back to the motorhome just to grab a sandwich because I hadn't had anything to eat, and I was literally just going to eat a sandwich and walk back out to pit road because that truck was dominant. He was able to go to the front. We had to come in, and we were involved in a skirmish at the very beginning. Had to come in and work on the front valence of the truck. It put Jeffrey back in the back a little bit, and he was working his way back up through there. And Kurt Busch actually got that was his first. That's when he was driving the truck series. That was his really first year in NASCAR, and he got into it with another driver, and it's just, they call it Jeffrey just right. It's almost sent him into the grandstand, and that really, unfortunately. That was probably the demise of that team. That team was really strong with Jeffrey behind the wheel, and then we had to put some other guys in there, and it just didn't work out. But the good thing was that Jeffrey survived that accident, because I thought for sure he was a goner. There was nothing left of that race truck except for the shell, and you could see his hands. You watch that video, you could see his arms actually scraping the surface as they're just loose, and you see him scraping the surface of the racetrack as he's flipping over and over again. And you're like, oh, boy, that's just in good. But
yeah, they added bars to the roll cage because of that crash.
Yeah, and I was in the motor coach trying to eat that sandwich, and when that wreck happened, I took off in a dead run, and I left my phone in the motor coach. I never got it back again that day. I couldn't call people I needed to or anything. It was just immediately go to the infield care center, and then we went to the hospital and everything like that. And finally I left and came back to the racetrack, and then, we knew he was going to survive, and I hadn't had a chance to talk to him or anything like that. And I went back to the hotel room, and I was badly shaken, because when you work with somebody like that day in and day out, you take it for granted. You become used to this. You don't think those guys are going to get hurt. Mm-hmm. And then when one does, but I'll never forget, I had my phone, finally got my phone back, and I had my phone, and it rings, and the name pops up, and it was Jeff Bodine. It was calling from the hospital. He wanted something. I guess he'd just woken up or whatever, and he wanted something, and his girlfriend had called me, and I could hear him in the background, tell him to do this, tell him to do that, or whatever. So I'll never forget, I brought Jeffrey something to the hospital the next morning, and we went in the hospital. I went in the room to see him and everything, and that was at that time they had CNN headline. It was CNN SI Sports Channel. It was a sports news cable station that's no longer around, but it was, they were battling ESPN back at that time, but they were showing that crash over and over again. And I'll never forget Jeffrey sitting in that hospital bed watching that replay, and he goes, "There I go!" And he's like, flipping over. He goes, "Oh, look at that!" And I was like, "Yeah, he's going to be fine." So it took a while for him to get back in the seat, but it was just fortunate that he did survive, and says a lot, even back in those days, how well prepared those machines were. Richie Waters, who was the crew chief on that truck, it was always taking great pride in the way he built race vehicles, and it proved itself that day. And Billy Blue also put a lot into it. And I honestly feel like, you'll never know, but I felt like we had the truck to beat that day. And just another buddy of mine had it won, Andy Houston, coming off of turn 2, but unfortunately he had too big of a lead. And I think Mike Wallace caught him right at the line. Andy's always told me I should have drugged my brake. I knew I was in trouble when I had that too big of a lead, but it was, so that's what I did to wrap that up. That was parts of 2 seasons, most of 2 seasons with that 60 Cup team, and left there and really started my career. That's what started my career mainly in the truck series for a number of years, because what a breath of fresh air that was. The truck series, you race on Fridays a lot of times, and Fridays or Saturdays, so you get part of your weekend back. Mm-hmm. And there again, the racing was just great. So I worked on a number of different initiatives, including managing the sports marketing program for CarQuest and for ASE. And then I spotted a lot for Jason Leffler, and we had a very competitive truck team there with the number 2 truck, Jim Smith. That's another West Coast guy there, and we were really, really good. And a number of times, finally, Leffler had a number of races where he should have won. And finally, we went to Dover, and he was able to get it done. And I'll never forget that. I had a stuffed monkey that I had purchased at a Walmart or something, because I felt like any day now that Jason was going to get that monkey off his back. And so when we went to Victory Lane, I reached in there and I said, "Here's your monkey." And he hopped out and threw that monkey off his back, and it was a great day. So working with Jason was always a lot of fun. That guy was Jason. He was a lot smarter than a lot of people knew. Hard to get to know, perhaps, in the very beginning, but once you got to know him, he was as funny as, he had a really dry sense of humor. He was a hilarious guy, and he's a guy that really liked to have a lot of fun. And it was a lot of fun spending time with him and his wife, and we were always very competitive in that truck. And matter of fact, if we finished out of the top 5, it was a bad day. Something was wrong. The truck wasn't handling or whatever, because with Jason, you really, I can't tell you how many times we finished second before we finally got that first win. And I never spotted for him when he won, but we lost one race by about 2 feet at Gateway one time when I was spotting for him. It was always a lot of fun. He was a very intense guy when he was behind the wheel, and he could get into it with the crew chiefs pretty good. If he didn't like what they were telling him, he would come right back at him. That was some of the greatest. I wish I'd recorded some of that stuff. It was just
the back and forth.
Oh, he was very, very intense, and he also ran. We go to IRP. He'd run the sprint cars and stuff like that. And I got to spot some of those events for him. I think I spotted for him at Irwindale in the sprints and the midgets, and also at IRP. And Jason came to me and said, okay, when you spot the truck for me, here's what you're looking for. When you run these cars, here's what I want you to communicate in a totally different way. And it was a different style of spotting, but it was a lot of fun. And man, he was a master. Huh. In both those types of cars. Jason could have driven anything. I think he did actually compete in the Indianapolis 500 one time. Mm-hmm. But he's a guy that certainly went too soon.
Yeah, I pitted a truck for him at Nashville, and I pitted a couple races for him when he was at Braun.
Yeah.
So those...
And he won. He won in those Braun cars.
Yeah.
He was,
Fortunately, I wasn't on any of those deals, but...
If Jason had so much success early on that he was probably went into Cup too early. He wasn't probably quite, if he did time things just right, he was with Gibbs, so it wasn't like he, wasn't in good equipment. But that wasn't the same Joe Gibbs racing as we see today. Not all their teams weren't completely dialed in at that point. Mm-hmm. And he struggled a little bit when he first went to Cup. But certainly he's a guy that had he found the right match at the right time, could have been successful in the Cup Series long term. But
it was him and JJ.
Yeah,
right? They were teammates.
Yes,
those two were supposed to take over the world, but it never worked out that way.
No, it didn't. It's always interesting to me to see guys come from either open wheel racing or in the sprints and the midgets and all that stuff. You see some guys that come up, and Tony Stewart being the prime example. Man, I mean, what can you say? Multiple time champion, won a ton of races. It was obvious from the very beginning that he got a stock car. Other guys, they just couldn't seem to figure it out. It's a different discipline. There's so much weight in these cars, and how you throw it around and all those things makes a difference. It'd be interesting to me. There's some guys that I would love to see come over here. Like, you take a look at Juan Pablo Montoya. I mean, this is a guy that won Formula One races, and he never really could master Cup cars on ovals. He was competitive, don't get me wrong, and he almost won Indy
until they got him.
Yeah,
man, that wasn't the speeding penalty.
Yeah, it's so that was that in-car radio is so heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is, and but there's a couple of guys. One of them would be a pipe dream to ever probably see him over here in a Cup car. That would be my number one. That would be Lewis Hamilton. I mean, I'd love to see him on a road course in a Cup car. I think it would be a thing of beauty. The other person I think could come over here and do what Tony Stewart did, and that would be, I think Joseph Newgarden can drive anything you put underneath him. I just think that guy may be the most talented race car driver in North America right now. I think he's got skills that other people just simply do not have. I mean, he's a guy, I think Joseph Newgarden could win Formula One races. And there's no doubt in my mind. I may be wrong. I mean, it's so hard to get into Formula One. He was actually on that path. He raced in Europe for a long time. But he obviously, the move to the Indy cars has been fantastic for him. He's been extremely competitive, even in inferior equipment. It was obvious that he's winning races. I mean, and not only winning road course races and stuff. I mean, he was going to Iowa and lapping the field. I mean, that in not Penske cars, he's a guy that I would love to see get the chance to run. Hopefully Roger Penske can figure out a way to run him at perhaps in some of the Xfinity off series, like, maybe at Road America or something like that. I did actually, I did get a chance to talk to Joseph about that at Watkins Glen last year. Or the year before, in 2016, I talked to him about it. He was up there just checking out because the Indy car was going back to Watkins Glen after a break, and so he was up there promoting that. And it was our NASCAR weekend, and so I got the chance to talk to him about. I just asked him, "Would you be interested in running?" Now he goes, "I would love to." He says, "I just got to find a way." To make it happen. That was even before he did the deal with Penske. Now it's a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier for him. All he needs to do is call Roger up and say, let's make this happen. But I think, that would be a treat for NASCAR fans, and it'd be a good way to cross promote both IndyCar and NASCAR.
There's been some one-off deals in that 22 Penske car that's produced some serious winners. Mm-hmm. It brought Allmendinger back. Kurt Busch got the win there. Tagliani was always super competitive. Yeah,
and Jacques Villeneuve.
Yeah,
won in that car as well. And there's a guy that doesn't care who you are or what you're driving or what number it is. If you're in his way, you're not going to be for long.
Who do you think on the NASCAR side could go and do well in the Indy 500?
I think Kyle Busch certainly could. I think Kyle's a guy that could drive almost anything. I was fortunate enough to work for Kyle when we owned Express Motorsports. I say we, the Scott family owned it, and I was president and general manager. We actually sold it to Kyle Busch, which became KBM. It became the first NASCAR-based KBM. They'd been running late models and stuff, but the first time they did a foray into the truck series was that year, and they bought out our building, they bought out all our stuff, all our trucks and everything, and Kyle came to me one day and said, "Well, what do you do here?" And I said, "Well, I sit behind the desk here and just make sure that everything run smoothly. I explained to him what I did and stuff like that. And he said, well, do you want to stay on? And I was like, well, I don't have a job, so that would be good. So I actually shared an office with Kyle for a number of months. Rick Wren was in there as the general manager, and then I was just helping Rick and trying to put a lot of the sponsorship stuff together with Kyle. And he was actually going through a transition that time with his management company and with his business manager. They had, after a number of years together, they had decided to split, and so they were looking for a new business manager through an agency and stuff like that. We were sitting in the room trying to find. They were discussing everything like that, and Kyle just looked over at me and said, "Well, why don't you do it?" And I was like, "If you want me to, I'll be more than happy to do it." So I ended up being Kyle's business manager for a year, and I tell you, I learned a lot, a whole lot about a number of different things. But the one thing that I did learn is that Kyle Busch is a machine. He's a machine. He's an animal. Nobody wrings the guts out of a race car harder than that guy does on a consistent basis. He can sit there and run. If you're running, I mean, if the lap times are 28.5 is probably the best that car is going to get. He's running a 28.51, a 28.52, a 28.51, a 28.52, a 28.53. Some guys have wild fluctuations on their lap times, really wild fluctuations. Kyle just, it doesn't have to be a perfect car for him. He's able to overcome so much. The guy's just, he's just, time will tell with the number of truck races he's won, with the number of Xfinity races he's won. He may actually one day challenge Richard for the 200 wins.
He's getting really close.
He's close to the 100 mark in the Xfinity Series.
I forget what the exact number is between his total wins across. He's getting very close to 200.
Yeah, and
like really close.
Take a look at those three series. They're all very competitive right now. It's not like it's, he's running against inferior, the Xfinity races. I mean, you're racing against Cup guys there or future Cup guys most of the times. I mean, he had to race Eric Jones hard for the last few years in that series before Eric came over into the Cup Series full time. So you're racing against really good guys, and it's never easy to win those things. And his ability to win, but man, he's fiercely determined, and I have the utmost respect for Kyle. And I'm sure he would tell you that he's not the easiest person to work with at times, but he really, it was an honor actually to work with him. As it ended up, my mom got sick and was battling cancer, and I actually quit that job to spend more time with her, to help her battle that. And that's the reason that I wasn't working with Kyle any longer. But he could win numerous Cup championships. I think him getting over that hurdle of finally winning that one, mentally, I think it was a big hurdle for him, and I think it's helped him, and wouldn't surprise me a bit to see him. Actually, that's one of the great things about this weekend is you've got three guys who've won Cup championships and knows what it takes. And Harvick, obviously Keselowski's won one, Kyle's won one now, and then you've got Truex, who's been the master of the mile and a half, so we're going to a mile and a half. So really, this is a crapshoot to see, who is going to reign supreme, as they say on the cooking show. To see who's going to come, because it's that all those teams are going to have, they're putting everything they can into it. 4 extremely capable guys that are all good on mile and a half racetracks.
I think the biggest misconception when it comes to Kyle is he's super cool to hang out with when he's away from the race car. I've been to a couple of his birthday parties. Coolest guy, but he is furiously competitive.
Oh, absolutely.
When he gets into that race car. And that's like, he's so far competitive, so aggressively competitive that there is no being nice. There is no being polite.
When he puts that helmet on, he's all business.
Yes. That scale is tipped so far to the competitive side that there is no,
and that's what's caused him.
side.
It's what's caused him to win so many races, but it's also what has caused him some of his issues. Obviously, you think back to the issue with Hornaday at Texas when he was unable to control his temper because he was just so mad. He just doesn't. He doesn't like to lose. He does not like to lose. But
and had he been watching that race, that wasn't really Hornaday's deal, if I remember correct, right? That wasn't, Hornaday didn't wreck him on purpose, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, he got
loose and slid up in, just the air came off and slid up into Kyle but the same thing that makes him great is the same thing that causes him problems sometimes. But I will say this, obviously away from the racetrack, he's competitive in business too. And I was in a lot of meetings with him, with a lot of different people trying to move KBM forward and stuff. And he was as intense there as he was on the racetrack in a lot of ways, but so good with fans, in so many situations, and so good with the little kids, and especially somebody that's been sick or something like that. Kyle, it just, he was magical with them, and he, when he knew that he needed to be, and he knew that these people needed his attention and they needed his help, he was more than willing to go that extra mile to make sure that person had a quality day and a quality meet and greet with him or whatever the case may be. He's true professional.
Look what he's doing now. Like was it last year Martinsville? He was sitting in traffic.
Yeah.
Saw a girl with a Kyle Busch hat on, stopped, rolled his window down, said, "Throw me your hat," and she's just kind of dumbfounded.
Yeah.
And now he goes around Saturday afternoons while people are watching the Xfinity race and goes and signs all their Kyle Busch stuff while they're gone.
Yeah.
So
he does that?
Yeah. It's incredible. So it's funny you're starting to be able to see through social media and stuff, that part of his personality.
Yeah, and that's exactly, he's got that, you're with me or you're against me.
Oh, there's no doubt. And like I say, that's part of that's what fuels him.
Yeah.
But he has an innate ability. Once he sits in that seat and he buckles himself in, he is able to transfer whatever that race car can give him. He can get the most out of it. Of all the guys that I've worked with, can't say enough about Jeff Gordon. Obviously a very tremendous driver, could do a lot of the same things. I never worked with Jeff on a day-to-day basis. Kevin Harvick, obviously a very talented guy. I never worked with him on a day-to-day basis. So maybe I would say the same thing about some of those guys if I had worked with them or listened to them on the radio all the time. Obviously you work with a guy, then you hear every word they say during the race weekend. I listen to every practice, everything. You want to know what's going on with your race team. If you're going to provide good input to help make things work better, then you need to know exactly what's going on. So I never worked with those guys on a day-to-day basis. Maybe they are. Kevin Harvick, I've got, he's got mad skills. He's another guy that can get a lot out of a race car, obviously by the number of races he's won in a number of different series as well. And then Brad Keselowski, he was a guy that early on when he first started running, when I first started working in the truck series, Brad was maybe 14 years old or something like that, if that. And his brother was actually the one that they were grooming to come up and stuff like that. And Brad would actually go to dinner and stuff, and he'd be the odd man out or whatever. A couple of years later, his dad was still racing at that time, Bob, and his uncle was still racing, and they actually drove in the truck series. At that point in time, it was a family-owned truck team. Well, they finally put Brad. I'll never forget this. His brother, and they probably put him in a late model or something to run something, and he just ran away with it. And everybody came to the racetrack, the truck race the next week, and they were like, "You couldn't believe what this kid did." Like we never thought he would be that guy. But obviously he had some talent. And then I spotted for a number of years for different guys in the truck series. And I used to spot for Timothy Peters and stuff like that when Timothy was first coming along. And I remember sitting up there and I would stand oftentimes next to Brad's mother, Kay, and she would be spotting for Brad, and you kind of watch out for the person you're standing next to, especially back then. And you didn't have 4 radios on like you do nowadays when you're spotting and stuff. So you, if you see something, oftentimes back then we didn't even have NASCAR in our ear. So if you saw something happen on the racetrack, you would tap the person next to you and point, even if you didn't know where their truck was, but you would want them so they could say to their guy on the radio, "Hey, there's trouble in turn 3," or whatever. So I remember watching Brad very closely. He was in far inferior equipment. They did not have the budget that they needed to run. Oftentimes he was running mid-pack or, but the amount of talent he had to squeeze out of that equipment, he ran far above. So actually, when Bobby Hamilton, I was working with Bobby Hamilton when Bobby got sick, unfortunately, and he had to step out of our truck, the Fastenal number 4 truck, in the truck series, and I tried to get Bobby to put Brad in there, as it turns out that didn't work out, but I felt like from the very beginning that Brad was going to have some success, and it was eventually a break in the truck series, and he got to drive Ted Musgrave's truck when Ted got mad on the racetrack, and he had to sit a race or two, and they put Brad in there, and Brad set the world on fire, and that's literally what led him to get the job with Dale Jr., which led to him obviously coming up. But I always felt like that Brad was a very talented guy, and obviously that's proven to be true.
So then when you got done working with Kyle, then you started working with Brian?
Yes, I did. One interim in between, I had met Steve Turner through working in the truck series when Steve was, first they had gotten a ride for James Boucher with Rick Crawford's team, and Steve was looking to buy a truck team or to start a truck team, and he had met with me several times when we were at Express. He actually at one point in time was interested in buying Express, and so I developed a relationship with Steve. My mom battled the cancer. I spent about 6 months doing that. She was able to overcome that, and then I was back here in Charlotte, and I literally wasn't doing anything. I got a call one afternoon, and it was Steve Turner, and he was at the Concord Airport, and he said, he goes, "I'm just passing through. Can you come down here and meet with me?" I was like, "Sure." So I went down there, and he told me that he was going to buy the Xfinity team. He had already started his truck series team at that point in time. I'd actually helped those guys with some flight programs and stuff like that, showed them how we did some of the stuff that we did at Express. So as it turns out, he was, you had mentioned that you worked with that team several times. And so he bought the Xfinity team. And so I did all the due diligence for that, and then he made me general manager of his truck series team, and we were very competitive. Won the championship that year. But before that, even that championship came up, I'd worked with Brian Scott for a number of years. Brian met with me and said, "I would like for you to be my business manager," and having worked with him and his dad, knowing them so well, that was an easy decision for me to, even though I enjoyed doing the Turner Motorsports stuff, I really, nothing was better than working for the Scotts. They're just great people. They treat all their employees very, very well. They're very fair with everyone. They're just really good people. And I knew there was a good comfort level. So at that point in time, I had helped Brian. I had introduced them to J.D. Gibbs and to Joe, and actually had helped them get that program together for Brian to drive for Joe Gibbs Racing in the Xfinity Series. And so Brian was starting his first year there, and so I went to back to work for Brian Scott as his business manager. I'd worked for his dad previously, and then I ended up working for Brian Scott Incorporated, and helped run all his initiatives from that time up until he retired at the end of last year. So, and cannot say enough about how well that family treated me. They didn't pay exorbitantly. They paid fair market value, but but the true joy was just in the fact that knowing that there was going to be less bull crap working with them than any other job, because as long as you gave your effort, they were going to be fair with you. And I consider both of them, Joe Scott, Brian's dad, as well as Brian, both of them. I talked to Joe Scott on the phone today. Both of them are just super, super people. And if you ever knew the true joy they've brought to a number of people and how much they've helped people in their community in the state of Idaho, they have a foundation, the Joseph and Catherine Albertson's Foundation, based out of Boise, Idaho, and that foundation provides somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 million annually to education in Idaho. And so they've helped a number of different people out and continue to do so. And they're just really quality people. But hardly ever see them out of anything but blue jeans. And talking to them is just like sitting here talking to you guys now. You can talk to them about anything. They're just really, really super people.
Think about all the hundreds of guys they fed in the NASCAR community for 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. It was definitely a 10-year program for the time that Brian was 18. I think when I first started working with him, so that was 2006 or 2007. It was in September of that year when I first started working with him in the Truck Series, and we worked all the way up through his career in the Truck Series. And then the only time that I didn't work with him, the only year I did not work with him in his racing career was the 1 year he spent at Braun. And it was odd that he was still racing for Braun when we did the due diligence with Steve Turner to buy it. Brian was one of the drivers, but oddly enough, I was already working on getting him before I even knew I was working with. I'd already introduced him to the Gibbs and trying to get that program going. Fortunately, they were able to do that. But it became kind of a conflict of interest for me, because all of a sudden I'm trying to help with the purchase of Braun in the Xfinity Series with Steve Turner, and Brian was one of our drivers, and I knew that Brian was going to go somewhere else. So it became a sort of a little bit of an issue, but not that big a one. And Brian obviously went on to Gibbs, and then on to RCR, where he had really good success and was competitive every week in the Xfinity Series there. We ran some cup races with RCR and had very competitive cars there. Brian did a great job in a number of those races. And then obviously his last year was with Richard Petty Motorsports in the 44 car, finished second at Talladega and had some good runs. But I would say that it was those years at Childress where we probably had the most competitive cars week in and week out.
Mm-hmm. So what you got going on now?
Me? I ride my bicycle. I try to help people out when they call on the phone. A lot of times people call and they say, what about this? Or I had a driver call me yesterday about a flight program, how he might want to accomplish that. There's a young guy that runs the Xfinity Series named Spencer Boyd. And I met him really through happenstance, and him and his dad Paul, they're really good people as well, and I've lent a helping hand just to them on some procedural issues, some management stuff, and to try to get them with the right people and where they need to go. So I'm just helping people out, But really, I ride. David will tell you this. I just bought a new bike, and I like to ride down on the greenways. I don't like riding on the road so much because of the way people drive and are looking at their phones. I don't think it's a good thing to live for a long time to ride on the roads. But I ride my bicycle along the greenway down around University of Charlotte, and you can go 35 miles back there with really no problem. And so I'll go ride my bike for 35 miles or further. The furthest I've made it, I think, is 55 miles. But my goal is to make 100 miles in a day, and I'll probably accomplish that next spring. So,
I've personally put hundreds of miles on the pavement with Emmett.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And actually, that was the great thing about working with Brian when I was his business manager the last few years. Him and his dad both. They knew that if they called me, there's a good chance I'd be on my bicycle. And I conducted a lot of business, stopping my bicycle, making a call, making sure that this was done or that was done, arranging stuff. Then I get right back on my bicycle and ride some more. It was, to me, it's just, I need to do something to stay in shape. And that's something I really, really enjoy. So I ride my bicycle and I do abstract paintings. That's basically what I do. And try to help people out when they call on the phone.
I appreciate you coming on, man.
It's been absolutely my pleasure.
This was fun. I learned a lot on this one.
Oh, yeah.
You on social media at all?
Not really, no. I got hacked. I did a lot of Brian's social media stuff, Brian Scott's social media stuff. I did a lot of his Twitter and his Facebook, and I got hacked by, I don't think it was Russia, There was some foreign state agent that hacked both my Facebook and Brian's, and as well as his Twitter. And I don't know how that happened, but it frustrated me to no end, because if you've ever had your Facebook page taken over and somebody's running ads for Gucci shoes on there and it looks like you, it makes you, so I was never a big one personally anyway. I'm more of an anonymous type guy. So I enjoy social media a lot, but, I'm not one of these people that's on it every day. And I really can't remember the last time I did a Facebook, on there, or maybe I'll plug your podcast for you guys, though.
Hey, there you go.
I can do
really
that.
appreciate that.
We're not above self promotion here.
Yeah.
Shameless plugs.
Bring them on.
Yeah, but you guys doing a great job, and
Thank you.
It's good to see, and it's great to be here in the studio, and I'll be glad to come back anytime.
Perfect. All right. Hope you guys
Check out the success box right there.
Yeah. Hope you guys like listening to Emmett. We will not be here next week because it's Thanksgiving. Oh, wait. Who wins this weekend?
You would think, as good as that 78's been on these mile and a halves, that would be, but he's the one guy who hadn't won a championship. Kyle, there again, we know how talented he is. He's good on mile and a halves. Keselowski, they have not been consistent, as consistently good as they've been in the past. For some reason, I'm just thinking it's Kevin Harvick, but I don't know. And I'm not necessarily for any of those guys. I know Kevin, I know Kyle, I know Brad, so I'm not really picking any of those guys. I don't know what it is. Something about when Tony Stewart said it best. If you saw the interview with him, I think it was after Texas, where he talked about how focused Kevin was and how driven he was, and he knew that he had something when he talked to him, and he could see that gleam in his eye. I think if you see that same look in his eye come Sunday at Homestead, he's going to be tough to beat. All those guys are going to be tough to beat, though.
Well, remember how he won the that championship, beating out Ryan Newman. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a dedicated, never say die. It's not the end. He had to go out and bully his way through that one too.
Yeah, and that's what Homestead brings you, is who can elevate their game not only for that weekend, but what we saw last year with Jimmy Johnson.
Wow.
I've never seen anybody drive a race car harder when so much was on the line than he did at the end of that race. He just, you could see it with your naked eye. The thing was just hanging out on the edge. He was driving that thing as hard as he possibly could without losing control. And, that determination and that skill won him the championship. Obviously, he's done it a number of times, 7 times. But just to see it, you could literally see it with your naked eye. Just an incredible performance. So, one of those 4 guys is going to have to bring that moment out of it.
And you're going to have to go win that race, really.
That's
what we've seen so far.
Yeah, and don't kid for a second that Chad Knaus and Jimmy are going to go down there with chips on their shoulders, saying that we should be here and watch them go down there and spank the field.
Yep.
Larson has something to prove.
Yeah.
Chase Elliott would love to get his first one there.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
Joey Logano.
He's had a struggling year,
but I think it'll be one of the 4. I honestly do. I think it'll be one of the 4. It just seems that's the way it's worked every year.
Yeah.
You had that great battle between Tony Stewart and Carl Edwards, just a tremendous battle.
Yeah.
And it was those 2 guys at the end of that race. It's so ironic that's the way it ends up. I remember when Alan Kawicki won his championship in '92 at Atlanta, and I was actually working with Richard Petty at the time when we were finishing out that documentary. That was Richard's last race, Jeff Gordon's first race, and the 2 guys battling for the championship were Kawicki and Elliott, and they put on a spirited battle throughout the course of that race and trading the lead back and forth, and eventually, if memory serves me correctly, Elliott won the race and Kawicki won it by leading the most laps. Is how he won the championship. So it just always seems to come down. Just seems to always come down to that. That's one of the great things about our sport.
Yeah, I think we're in for a good one. I think that Harvick pulls it out also. I think that the 78 has definitely had the best car, but the best car doesn't always win. I think that these past couple of races that they've kind of been knocked off, I think their steam's been kind of taken away. I wouldn't count out the 2 because it always seems to work out that they always have such a good game plan of calling races that they can always pull one out. When you don't ever see them winning a race, all of a sudden the 2 wins.
Well, how many championships has Penske won in so many forms of motorsports? Yeah. That they're throwing everything that they have over there right now.
Oh yeah.
that too. I mean, it means so much to them. It means so much to all these guys,
especially with those two cars being Ford cars.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Ford is, and that's Ford's weekend.
Right.
So Ford's throwing everything they got at, and this is the first time that Harvick's been in a Ford.
Right.
So they, Stewart
500.
Yeah, Stewart Haas Racing won the 500, and then now they're fighting for a championship with the first time being in a Ford.
Yeah.
And then Kyle, man.
Kyle's just one of those guys that if all of a sudden you just give him enough, he's not going to be denied.
Yeah.
And, you can say that certainly about him, about Harvick. Brad's proven that he can be that way too. Martin Truex is the wild card because we haven't seen him in a championship.
Their story
situation.
That's there's not going to be a dry if they win the race and the championship. There's not going to be a dry eye in victory lane.
Yeah.
With all the stuff going down with Sherry, Jim, and then Barney.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just had a heart attack and then had to have surgery. God, all this stuff keeps going on. All this stuff. It's such a you could write a book, a movie.
Yeah, you certainly could. Their year has been just incredible, and even their second car. I mean, Eric Jones has had a really good year. He's competitive every week now. He'll be a factor next year in the Gibbs cars. Certainly, not to say that he hasn't been this year. I mean, it's tough for a rookie. I mean, I think Jeff Gordon knocked 18 front clips off his car his first year or something like that. I mean, he was competitive, but it takes him a while to learn. And so that's another guy coming up. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch this weekend. And I'll be watching it.
It's definitely going to be exciting.
I'm ready for it.
But like I was going to say, we will not be here next weekend, so that is a perfect opportunity to go through the 15 previous episodes. You can find them on youngandpruitt.com. You can find them on the podcast app, the Young and Pruitt podcast. Go ahead and hit us a review, subscribe, do all that stuff. You guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at JackmanZack.
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at TallGuyTurbo.
And you can find me on my bicycle.
Perfect. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. See ya.
See ya.